Hello, hello. Oh, I have my ring on. Let me take that off. Hello, everybody. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar, and I am here to answer your questions about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, you'll notice something very different. I have a green screen. And you'll also notice that it's not perfect. I just set this thing up today, and it's a bit of a learning curve to work with. What's interesting is that it took me several hours of a little bit of DIY and a little bit of a lot of DIY and a lot of tweaking to get it to look right. And I did one of my gaming streams and everything looked perfect. And then between ending the gaming stream and starting these recordings, because it's late at night like I normally do, nothing really changed except I rebooted my computer and somehow that screwed everything up, and it was all like flickering and everything. You'll notice it's not perfect right now. My head is doing something weird over there. The glowing from the headphones is really messing it. If I take off the headphones, it's a little better, but I also have a green sort of glow to me, like I'm in the film version of The Lord of the Rings, like the Oathbreakers, the dead men of Dunharrow. So I'm sort of tweaking it. As we go, I'm hoping that it will improve. I think the main thing is that my lighting has to change. The lamp that I'm working with is excellent for if I'm not using green screen, but if I am, I don't think it's quite adequate. I'm going to need something else. So just, bear with me while we do this, but hopefully it doesn't look too weird. I mean, there was parts where I was partially transparent. There were parts where I had no color at all. And like I said, it looked really great on today's live stream on Twitch. I'm not sure why it looks like this now. It took me another hour of tweaking, and now it's starting to get late, and I'm like, oh my god, I got to get all these recordings done for this video. One really cool thing is I'm going to read to you guys from the Silmarillion in a bit, but I was like, part of the Silmarillion's cover here is a little bit in green, so I wonder what it would look like when I held it up, and you guys got to see this. Oh, that's so cool, though. That is like, even the Elvish letters are like that because they're in green, So that's really cool. I'm sitting here in Bag End and everything, so yeah. I'm going to try to make this a little bit of a shorter video just because, like I said, just because it is so late when I'm recording this. I'm still going to do the same questions. We have 10 questions and everything. I'm just going to try not to blather on too long in each one. Like I said, when I initially configured the green screen and everything, I did it during the day, so there was a little bit of natural light coming in. So then when I went at night, I was like, okay, now I have to tweak it for nighttime because there's no natural light. And it worked fine, but then somehow after rebooting, it screwed things up a little bit. So the thing with up here, I don't know how to stop that, really. One thing that I tried doing was like leaning the lamp over, but as you can see, it causes its own issues, So I think I'm going to have to look into a different lighting solution, and it may be a little while before I'm able to do that. But anyway, let's get into the video. I just wanted to let you guys know that, yes, I did purchase the green screen. I set it up today. It came yesterday. I set it up today. So we're all good on that. Quick channel update. We are up to 2,059 subscribers, which is pretty great. That's just going pretty rapidly. Really nothing to say there. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed already, consider it. By the end of the video, you'll know whether or not you want to subscribe or not, right? And consider membership if you'd like that as well. But let's go on to reading a little bit of the Silmarillion, which is, like I said, amazing with the green screen. That's so cool. And I'm going to read you guys a little bit on the Rings of Power and the Third Age, in which these tales come to their end. And I've said it many times that, as a matter of fact, I think last episode, that the Silmarillion itself is in fact the entire chronology, and it includes a section that is the Lord of the Rings. Now, it's not just a shortened version of the Lord of the Rings, it's a lot of the backstory as well, the stuff that's talked about in the Council of Elrond and the Shadow of the Past and all that. But I'm going to give you like the first couple of pages or so. It's not going to get into the actual text of the Lord of the Rings, which is the very last bit of it. It's a short chapter, but I'm going to give you a little bit of it. Here we go. Of old there was Sauron the Maya, whom the Sindar and Beleriand named Gorthaur. In the beginning of Arda, Melkor seduced him to his allegiance, and he became the greatest and most trusted of the servants of the enemy, and the most perilous, for he could assume many forms. And for long, if he willed, he could still appear noble and beautiful, so as to deceive all but the most wary. When Thangorodrim was broken and Morgoth overthrown, Sauron put on his fair hue again, and did obeisance to Eonwa, the herald of Manwë, and abjured all his evil deeds. And some hold that this was not at first falsely done, but that Sauron in truth repented, if only out of fear, being dismayed by the fall of Morgoth and the great wrath of the lords of the West. But it was not within the power of Eonwa to pardon those of his own order, and he commanded Sauron to return to Aemon, and there receive the judgment of Manwë. Then Sauron was ashamed, and he was unwilling to return in humiliation, and to receive from the Valar a sentence, it might be, of long servitude in proof of his good faith, for under Morgoth his power had been great. Therefore, when Eonwa departed, he hid himself in Middle-earth, and he fell back into evil, for the bonds that Morgoth had laid upon him were very strong. In the great battle and the tumults of the fall of Thangorodrim, were mighty convulsions in the earth, and Beleriand was broken and laid waste, and northward and westward many lands sank beneath the waters of the great sea. In the eastern Osirion, the walls of Ered Luin were broken, and a great gap was made in them towards the south, and a gulf of the sea flowed in. Into that gulf the river Lune fell by a new course, and it was called therefore the Gulf of Lune. That country had of old been named Lindon by the Noldor, and this name it bore thereafter, and many of the Eldar still dwelt there, lingering, unwilling yet to forsake Beleriand when they had fought and laboured long. Gil-galad, son of Fingon, was their king, and with him was Elrond half-elven, son of Earendil the Mariner, and brother of Elros, the first king of Númenor. Upon the shores of the Gulf of Lune, the elves built their havens, and named them Mithlond, and they beheld many ships, for the harbourage was good. From the grey havens the Eldar ever and anon set sail, fleeing from the darkness of the days of the earth, for by the mercy of the Valar, the firstborn could still follow the straight road and return, if they would, to their kindred in Erisea and Valinor, beyond the encircling seas. Others of the Eldar there were who crossed the mountains of Ered Luin in that age and passed into the inner lands. Many of these were Teleri, survivors of Doriath and Osiriand, and they established the realms among the Sylvan elves in woods and mountains far from the sea, for which nonetheless they ever yearned in their hearts. Only in Eregion, which men called Holland, did elves of Noldor in race establish a lasting realm beyond the Ered Luin. Eregion was nigh to the great mansions of the dwarves that were named Khazad-dûm, but by the elves of Hathrodrond, and afterwards Moria. From Most in Ethel, the city of the elves, the high road ran to the west gate of Khazad-dûm, for a friendship arose between dwarves and elves such as has never been elsewhere seen, to the enrichment of both these peoples. In Eregion, the craftsmen of the Gwaithim Erdain, the people of the jewelsmiths, surpassed in cunning all that had ever wrought, set only Feanor himself. And indeed greatest of skill among them was Celebrimbor, son of Curufin, who was estranged from his father, and remained in Nargothrond when Celegorm and Curufin were driven forth, as is told in the Quenta Silmarillion. Elsewhere in Middle-earth there was peace for many years, yet the lands were, for the most part, savage and desolate, save only where the people of Beleriand came. Many elves dwelled there indeed, and they had dwelt there the countless years, wandering free in the wide lands far from the sea. But they were Avari, to whom the deeds of Beleriand were but a rumour, and Valinor only a distant name. And in the south, and in the further east, men multiplied, and most of them turned to evil, for Sauron was at work. Seeing the desolation of the world, Sauron said in his heart that the Valar, having overthrown Morgoth, had again forgotten Middle-earth, and his pride grew apace. He looked with hatred on the Eldar, and he feared the men of Númenor, who came back at whiles in their ships to the shores of Middle-earth. But for long he dissembled his mind, and concealed the dark designs that he shaped in his heart. Men he found the easiest to sway of all the peoples of the earth. But long he sought to persuade the elves to his service, for he knew that the firstborn had the greatest power. And he went far and wide among them, and his hue was still that of one both fair and wise. Only to Lindon did not he come, for Gil-galad and Elrond doubted him in his fair seeming. and though they knew not who in truth he was, they would not admit him to that land. But elsewhere the elves received him gladly, and few among them hearkened to the messengers from Lindon bidding them beware, for Sauron took to himself the name of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. And they had at first much profit from his friendship, and he said to them, Alas for the weakness of the great! For a mighty king is Gil-galad, and wise in all lore is Master Elrond, and yet they will not aid me in my labours. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Eressëa, nay, even as Valinor? And since you have not returned thither as you might, I perceive that you love this Middle-earth as do I. Is it not, then, our task to labour together for its enrichment, and for the raising of all the elven kindreds that wander here untaught to the height of that power and knowledge which those have who are beyond the sea? It was in Eregion that the counsels of Sauron were most gladly received, for in that land the Noldor desired ever to increase the skill and subtlety of their works. Moreover, they were not at peace with their hearts, since they had refused to return to the west, and they desired both to stay in Middle-earth, which indeed they loved, and yet to enjoy the bliss of those that had departed. Therefore they hearkened to Sauron, and they learned of him many things, for his knowledge was great. In those days the smiths of Ostin Ethel surpassed all they had contrived before, and they took thought, and they made rings of power, but Sauron guided their labours. And he was aware of all they did, for his desire was to set a bond upon the elves and to bring them under his vigilance. Now the elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made one ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it, to subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last. And much of the strength and will of Sauron passed into that one ring, for the power of the elven rings was very great, and that which should govern them must be a thing of surpassing potency, and Sauron forged it in the mountain of fire in the land of shadow. And while he wore the one ring, he could perceive all the things that were done by means of the lesser rings, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore them. But the elves were not so lightly to be caught. As soon as Sauron set the one ring upon his finger, they were aware of him, and they knew him, and perceived that he would be master of them, and of all that they had wrought. Then, in anger and fear, they took off their rings, but he, finding that he was betrayed and that the elves were not deceived, was filled with wrath, and he came against them with open war, demanding that all the rings should be delivered to him, since the elven smiths could not have attained to their making without his lore and counsel. But the elves fled from him, and 3 of their rings they saved, and bore them away and hid them. Now these were the 3 that had last been made, and they possessed the greatest powers, Narya, Nenya, and Vilya. They were named the Rings of Fire, and of Water, and of Air, set with ruby, and adamant, and sapphire. And of all the elven rings, Sauron most desired to possess them, for those who had them in their keeping could ward off the decays of time, and postpone the weariness of the world. But Sauron could not discover them, for they were given to the hands of the wise, who concealed them, and never again used them openly while Sauron kept the ruling ring. Therefore the 3 remained unsullied, for they were forged by Celebrimbor alone, and the hand of Sauron never touched them, yet they were also subject to the one. Oh, right as I'm ending. And that is because I did reboot the computer, and that's another thing that always seems to go awry as the system sounds come up. I normally mute those, so I'm sorry. I'm glad that only happened at the very ending there. I've muted it now. There are more messages coming through that are not making noises. So there's the first little bit of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, which is the final chapter of the Silmarillion, and the one that represents the Lord of the Rings. Oh, and the Hobbit as well, but the Hobbit is barely more than a sentence in there. And you notice it's a lot of the backstory. First, we get a bit of a recount of the end of the First Age, because we're meant to understand that each chapter in this is sort of written by a different person. And they're all compiled, in a place like Imladris, in these different scraps of paper and parchment that Bilbo would go through and translate and put together into a book, which he called translations of Elvish lore, or translations from Elvish lore we call the Silmarillion. And, of course, one of those parts is called Quenta Silmarillion, but each of these parts is likely written by a different elf. And in this case, it is largely believed, though never outright stated in the actual text, that it was Elrond who wrote this, which is interesting because he has to write about himself at certain parts. And he's sort of not thinking of this as part of a greater whole. That's why he says, okay, well, first we have to tell you who Sauron is and who Morgoth is and what happened with the War of Wrath and how Beleriand fell and what Mithlond is and Lindon and Eregion and all this. And then, of course, just, okay, now we're in the Third Age. Notice it does gloss over the Second Age. It mentions Elros, it mentions Numenor, but it really just, this is a story of the Third Age. It's just giving you a bit of the backstory so that you understand it, which is why basically almost any chapter of, well, not individual chapters, but any section of the Silmarillion can sort of hold on its own. You could read Ainur Lindala and nothing else, and you get a story. You could read the Vala Quenta without having read Ainur Lindala, and you're fine. You could read Quenta Silmarillion without having read the previous parts, and you're fine. Akalabeth, same thing, and then of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. It makes references to some things that you might not understand, like Feanor and whatnot, but, that's just sort of the way it is. Now, there's a few things here. A lot of people ask, the question that comes up a lot about the rings is, why did they lose their power once the one was destroyed? And especially the three that were made after it. And this basically tells you outright, it's because they were made with Sauron's methods. And I'm going to read this one section again here. Now the elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made one ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it, to be subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last. So basically, when you bind something to something else, because it's not just one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, it's also one ring to bring them all in the darkness. Bind them to what? Bind them to the one which is bound to Sauron, because the ring is basically a part of Sauron. He let the greater part of his power pass into it. So what we see here is he's saying it's not just the rings. You notice that it says the one ring gives him power over all the other rings and everything created with them. So all of the things that the elves do with their rings would be subject to Sauron at this point. So, it's a good thing that, he didn't give them a lot more time to get used to the rings and become enamored with them and wish to, to keep them, because then he may have succeeded. Maybe they would have not perceived him so quickly. But of course, Sauron can become rather impatient at times. But anyway, that was a little bit of the Silmarillion for you. So we're going to get into your questions. I do have 10 questions to get through this week, and I'm going to try not to make this too long of a video. Not because I don't want to do long videos, but because, like I said, it is very late, because I spent so much time tweaking and fiddling with the green screen settings that I hope that we come to some sort of permanent solution where it's going to be easy for me, but this is literally my first day of using it. So let's get to your first question. Our first question comes in from Tonislav, who asks, which of Tolkien's characters is most like Beowulf? So this is really interesting because, as I've talked about, Beowulf is one of Tolkien's biggest influences. He did his own translation of Beowulf, which is very, very good. One of the most well-received translations. Of course, it took a long time to come out to the general public, but of course he was a professor of English and Old English literature, and Beowulf was one of his favorite subjects to teach. So in the Legendarium, in his work, there are two characters that most resemble Beowulf, but in different ways. The first character that I'm going to talk about is Turin Turambar. He's the character that most resembles Beowulf in the narrative form. He's a flawed hero who came to live with a king, and then later was sent out to slay a dragon. He killed the dragon, but died himself in the process. The Children of Húrin is sort of a much darker and more tragic tale than Beowulf, as it is also influenced by other works like the Scandinavian sagas such as the Kullervo or Sigurd the Volsung, and the Greek tragedy Oedipus Rex. But the shadow of Beowulf looms over all of Tolkien's work. Now, Tom Shippey, you may have heard this name before. Tom Shippey is probably the greatest Tolkien scholar in the world. And he called Beowulf the single biggest influence on Tolkien. And several of his stories come off as reflections of Beowulf. And I agree with Shippey here. The Children of Húrin is a very dark reflection of Beowulf, while something like Farmer Giles of Ham, which is not part of the Legendarium, but you can see it as a whimsical fairy story reflection of Beowulf, because it is, about a hero who comes to be with a king and then goes off to fight a dragon. You can see that he's very attracted to that sort of thing, because he basically tells Beowulf over and over and over again, but in differing ways. And of course, Farmer Giles of Ham has this very comedic and lighthearted tone. If you've never read it, it's sort of like The Hobbit, but an even sillier version of The Hobbit. I would highly recommend it. It's a very interesting read. But that's the narrative function. Now, the other character that I want to talk about that resembles Beowulf, not as a narrative function, but as a character, the guy who's most like the character of Beowulf, not that his story plays out like Beowulf, would be Beorn. From The Hobbit. Now, we have to go into a little bit of linguistics here. The name Beorn translates simply as man. But in the early drafts of The Hobbit, he wasn't called Beorn, he was called Medved, which is very similar to Medved, which is a Slavic word that means bear. Its transliteration is honey eater, because bears eat honey. Now, we're told that Beorn raises bees, and honey and mead are served in his hall. The name Beowulf also translates as honey wolf, transliterates as honey wolf. The translation would be honey eater or bear. And going back to Tom Shippey again, I know I'm quoting him a lot today, but Tom Shippey noted that Beorn, out of all of Tolkien's creations, is the most like Beowulf in his personality, in his temperament. And he does not destroy the dragon in the story, because that's not his narrative function. That's left for Bard. And Bard himself was actually a late addition to the story. When Tolkien was telling it, in the oral sense to his children, he was going to have Bilbo somehow slay the dragon, and he hadn't quite gotten to that point where he figured out how Bilbo was going to do this, but he realized that no matter what he came up with, his children were never going to bite that. They were never going to say, oh yes, we believe this. They were going to go, oh come on, Dad, that's a load of rubbish. How could Bilbo slay the dragon? So he created Bard for that reason. And there are other influences on Beorn himself. He wasn't just purely Beowulf. He greatly resembles a character from the saga of Hrolfr Krakil, who was cursed to turn into a bear every night. In Beorn's case, it's less of a curse and more that it's his very nature. Gandalf even said he's not sure whether he's a man who can become a bear or whether he's a bear that can become a man. Now, of course, that's Gandalf speaking. Tolkien himself said that he was a man that could become a bear. So it's just Gandalf, in this sense, didn't know which he is. He's a skin changer. But in the linguistics, is interesting because Beowulf and Medved are both honey eater, which translates as bear. Of course, he got changed to Beorn, which means man, because he is both man and bear. But Beowulf is, can be translated as bear as well. So it's just really interesting the way that all worked out. And of course, he's sort of this gruff, almost rude individual, but who is also a good person and a hero. That's Beowulf to a T there. So here we go. All right, good questions. Move on to the next one. Our next question comes in from Gary G, who asks, apparently the 6th and 7th age of Middle-earth is meant to be our own time, but I don't see how Arda and our Earth are congruent with each other. For example, how would Adam and Eve play into Tolkien's cosmology? Why are the land masses so different, etc.? So I don't want to ring the bell that says it's fictional, but rather it's the author's conceit. That's the bell that I'm going to ring in this case. I feel like I should have an actual little bell. Maybe I should get one that I could ring for cases like that. I had a friend who had a bell that he kept, just in his living room. And then anytime somebody said something that he thought was funny or interesting or noteworthy, he would do a little ring. He was like, that was bell-worthy. Ding, ding. Anyway, there's a few questions to unpack here, but let me explain the whole idea of the author's conceit. No one is really meant to think that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and such actually happened in the distant past, nor are we meant to take the Silmarillion as a religious text, but we are to understand that it is a religious text for the elves. Tolkien had a fanciful idea, a conceit, that he did not actually write these stories. Of course he did, but this was the conceit. He didn't actually write the stories. He translated them from the languages that they were written in, like Quenya and Sindarin for the Silmarillion, or Westron for the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, and likely some parts of the Silmarillion were probably written in Adonaic. The idea is that someone named Elfwine traveled to the Undying Lands and then brought to England a book called the Red Book of Westmarch, and brought it to J.R.R. Tolkien, who translated it into English through whatever means, piecemeal. Now, in it were three main sections. The first was There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Tale, which was written by Bilbo Baggins. The second was The Downfall of the Lord of the Rings and the Return of the King, by Frodo Baggins, with accounts from his friends and the wise. And finally, Translations of Elvish Lore, written by several unknown authors, we mentioned this earlier, and translated by Bilbo Baggins during his convalescence in Rivendell. Tolkien was cheeky. He was not serious about these stories having happened in the past. He obviously wrote them, which is why there are 16 volumes that greatly concern his drafts and his writing process. However, this does not mean that these questions cannot be answered. For the land masses being different, I'm going to point to the words of Gandalf the Grey in the Council of Elrond. I'm going to read you a brief passage here. Then said Glorfindel, let us cast it into the deeps, and so make the lies of Saruman come true. For it is clear now that even at the council his feet were already on a crooked path. He knew that the ring was not lost forever, but wished us to think so. For he began to lust for it himself. Yet oft in lies truth is hidden. In the sea it would be safe. Not safe forever, said Gandalf. There are many things in the deep waters, and seas and lands may change, and it is not our part here to make thought only for a season, or for a few lives of men, or for a passing age of the world. We should seek a final end of this menace, even if we do not hope to make one. The lands may change. It's not just a possibility, something that might happen, but it's a definite thing that Gandalf is aware of. Middle-earth was once one compact landmass with a large lake in the center, and the Valar lived on an island in the middle of it. Think of this as Pangaea. Then, after the first wars of the Valar, it became the familiar map of the First Age. Beleriand sank, Numenor was raised up, and then it sank. The lands change, and not always out of natural drifts and erosion and things like that, but sometimes through cataclysm. The Akalabeth broke the world and made it round, creating new lands, destroying others, not just Numenor. So a lot more can happen that would greatly change the land masses. Now, go to the Adam and Eve thing. Adam and Eve is a creation myth, much like the Ainur, and an origin myth, much like the tale of the awakening of the 144 elves. So we'll say that as the elves came up with one version of creation, men came up with another version of creation. They may have at one point had access to the Silmarillion, but they may have thought it was just a story. Adam and Eve even has some similarity to the creation myth of the dwarves, who mentions 7 fathers of the dwarves, and buried in the deepest, hardest to find lore, you'll find mention of 6 dwarf mothers, answering this sort of common question to who did the children of Adam and Eve marry? It's a question that comes up all the time, and this is one of those things where you say, well, not everything that happened was written down. Creation myths are also not meant to be perfect. And I dare say they're not always meant to be literal. They're meant to be didactic, to teach lessons and to impart wisdom. In the book Morgoth's Ring, there's a section called Myths Transformed. And this is filled with all sorts of ideas that I feel the music's very loud here, isn't it? I don't know. It's at the normal volume. I just lowered it a little more. I just feel it's loud on my end is what it is. Hopefully it wasn't too loud for you guys. I just lowered it a little bit. So this section in Morgoth's Ring called Myths Transformed, which is filled with ideas that Tolkien had never put into the Legendarium. They never made it in, including the thought that the Silmarillion was, for all intents and purposes, really just a story, and that the actual events were different. In some ways, they were more mundane, like there were no lamps, there were no trees of Valinor, the world was always round, the sun and the moon are just as they are in reality, and in other ways, it was way more insane. Angband, the fortress of Morgoth, was on the moon. This would make Ainur Lindala and Valaquenta and a big chunk of Quenta Silmarillion the religious text of the elves, but not necessarily historic events. Finally, I would state, don't be so literal. We're never even told how long the Fourth Age and the Fifth Age and all that are, or what the events are that end each age. And keep in mind that while a great chunk of the world follows the Abrahamic religions that include Adam and Eve, there are a lot of people that don't, and they have their own creation myths, some of them very unique. So basically what I'm saying here is, and this is weird coming from me, but you're overthinking it a little bit. It's meant to be the past, but it's a mythological past. It's not a historical past. So you don't have to reconcile it with reality that much. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Katie Green, who asks, what age was Narsil forged? And Telchar forged weapons for Thingol in the First Age. How is it possible that he was still around in the Second Age, and the family of Elendil came from Numenor? How would they acquire it? Well, no one ever claimed that Telchar was around in the Second Age. Narsil was absolutely forged in the First Age. As mentioned by Aragorn himself, I'm going to read you a very brief little bit of The Lord of the Rings. Slowly Aragorn unbuckled his belt, and himself set his sword upright against the wall. Here I set it, he said, but I command you not to touch it, nor to permit any other to lay a hand on it. In this elvish sheath dwells the blade that was broken and has been remade again. Telchar first wrought it in the depths of time. In the deeps of time is what it actually says. Death shall come to any man that draws Elendil's sword, save Elendil's heir. So in the deeps of time, or in the depths of time, as I accidentally said, it's a lot like saying the Elder Days, the First Age. Now, of course, Telchar was a dwarf, and dwarves, they live a few hundred years, but he wouldn't have been around during the Second Age. The Second Age of Tolkien's Legendarium is not very fleshed out. We know of Akalabeth, of course, and a few other stories, but there's a lot of years and there's a lot of stories that are unaccounted for. The only mention of Narsil is at the very end when Elendil has it. One's mind need not boggle at how the sword got to Numenor. It's sort of like how several swords from Gondolin wound up in a troll horde in Eriador. In the case of the Gondolin swords, they were likely plundered from Gondolin by Morgoth's forces and exchanged hands among evil creatures throughout the years, plundered and replundered, until 3 dimwit trolls have them stashed in a cave. In the case of Narsil, it is very easy to track. We do not know for whom Telchar made this sword, but as he was known to make weapons for Thingol, as you pointed out, and Thingol absolutely loved to collect swords and receive them as gifts. Let's say that the sword was in Doriath. This is, of course, conjecture, but it's strong conjecture. From here, it may have found its way into the west, into Valinor, and perhaps even Melian herself may have carried it there, for all we know. We know that the elves of Erisea would often come to Numenor, and a lot of times they bore gifts. So it's not unreasonable to assume that Narsil was a gift for one of the kings of Numenor at some point, given by the elves, who brought it from a place like Doriath, for example, or wherever it was in Middle-earth when Telchar made it. So at some point it was salvaged by Elendil and brought to Middle-earth, much as objects like the Palantir were given to the elves of Numenor and then brought to Middle-earth. In that case, it was Isildur that brought them to Middle-earth. And the Palantiri were made in the First Age, likely by Fëanor himself. So, Fëanor wasn't around in the Second Age. I mean, he was in the sense that he was in Mandos, but like I said, objects have a way of exchanging hands, and we don't always need like a direct chain of custody. Sometimes you can kind of figure, okay, I can kind of figure how that happened. So there you go. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Kumali Kokavali, who asks, was Boromir a brave man? How brave was he? He charged with Aragorn on Balrog to aid Gandalf. At the end, he fell in a fight to rescue Merry and Pippin. I think he was redeemed himself. I think the mistake that's being made here is equating bravery with redemption. Or to be more precise, equating a lack of bravery with the need for redemption. Boromir was, of course, a flawed character. He was ignorant, sometimes willfully so. He lacked faith. He seemed to think that Gondor was all of Middle-earth. He oftentimes spoke on issues that he ought to have kept silent on, and he had sort of an anti-intellectual streak that made him disbelieve the words of Elrond and Gandalf, seeing himself as more in the know about Mordor because he was on the front lines of the war, ignoring all that they had done. That is not to say that he was a bad person. These are only his flaws laid bare. None of Boromir's flaws equated to cowardice. Now, I should mention at this point that brave and fearless are not the same thing. They're not even really all that similar. Anyone in the situation of being in the Fellowship of the Ring who lacks fear would be, I think, a fool. Even Legolas, who is immortal and bodily death would be just a mere inconvenience to him. He would fear for his people, he would fear for his land, he would fear for his friends. The same could be said of the eternal Maya Gandalf, who willfully sacrificed himself. He was afraid what the Balrog may do if it came out of Moria. Fear is an excellent motivator for bravery. Bravery is just overcoming fear, not lacking fear. Boromir had fears of his own. The closest that he comes to cowardice is that he states that he will only go into Moria if every other member of the Fellowship votes against him, which that doesn't happen, and he knows it's not going to happen because he has Legolas on his side. When the need, however, rises to swiftly go to escape the wargs, he doesn't hesitate. This wasn't Boromir being really a coward, but, he wished to favor the known above the unknown. However, when the danger of the known is made more plain, he opts for the unknown. I would argue that Boromir, for however much he whined during the journey and annoyed Aragorn, he didn't really need redemption. His worst deed was attempting to take the One Ring from Frodo by force, which was not really his own will. It was the will of the One Ring. Remember now that the One Ring is sentient and at least partially sapient, and thus it would rather go with a guy who wishes to keep it safe rather than those that wish to cast it into the fire of Mount Doom. Boromir doesn't see it this way. He thinks bringing it to Mordor is practically delivering it to Sauron, and he doesn't see that keeping it in Gondor is the worst option. Now, interesting thing to talk about here, the only other character who thinks of the ring in the way that Boromir does is actually Gollum. Now, of course, Boromir does not immediately covet the ring the way that Gollum did, and he never touched it the way that Gollum did. He didn't touch it at all. But Gollum himself did once ask Frodo to give him the ring so that he could take it far away where Sauron will never find it. Now, of course, he wanted the ring for himself. There's no doubt about that, but he wasn't only being selfish. He certainly was being selfish, but he wasn't only being selfish in asking Frodo for the ring. Even Gollum saw the danger that Sauron posed, and he didn't want him to have the ring. Now, seeing as how Gollum was personally tortured by Sauron, and he hated him more than he loved the ring, I would say that Gollum was being at least partially sincere here. Of course, in his rant that leads to him trying to take the ring from Frodo, Boromir imagines himself as a king, and that he could lead Gondor to victory. But this is all really the ring talking. As soon as Frodo absconds from the scene, Boromir comes to his senses. He readily admits his mistake as well. while I don't feel that Boromir was in great need of redemption, he may have felt that way. It's an understandable thought. His protection of Merry and Pippin didn't even give him that much comfort. Among his last words to Aragorn before he passed away was that they took the halflings. It was an admission of failure on his part. He didn't even have enough breath in him to tell Aragorn which halflings are taking, which Aragorn had to deduce himself. What I'm getting at here is Boromir was always brave, even when he was whining that things weren't going his way. He did not necessarily redeem himself, but he may not have actually needed any redemption. He fell under the shadow of the One Ring, something that even Bilbo did, and eventually Frodo did. Possibly the only reason that it didn't happen to him sooner was the proximity of Narya and Nenya. Note that it wasn't until they left Lothlorien that they noticed a change in Boromir. So there's that as well. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Victorinox Rush, who asks, why did Arwen have to become human to marry Aragorn if she could have remained an elf and returned to her father and mother in Erisea? So, marrying Aragorn and then later sailing to the west as an immortal elf would be unduly cruel for Arwen. And by the way, Erisea is just part of the Undying Lands. Some people seem to think that everybody who sails west winds up there. It's a small little island. Some of the Noldor go there, but not all elves go there. So, firstly, it's incorrect to state that Arwen became human. She was always human. Elves are not, by the reckoning of Tolkien, a different species from us. Both mortal men and immortal elves are the children of Ilúvatar. The difference is not physiological or genetic or biological, it's spiritual. The primary difference is our doom. The elves must stay in the world and linger until its conclusion, while mortals can die and pass from the world. Even when elves die through violence or through sorrow, they still linger in the world, and they could even return with new bodies that are identical to their old ones. That being said, it is the difference of doom that is the reason that Arwen made her choice, which she describes to Frodo as being the choice of Lúthien. Arwen was not an elf. In the strictest terms, she was Perithal, half-elf, with heritage from mortals and from immortals. The Perithal were normally mortal, but because of the actions of her grandparents, Elendil and Elwing, she had a choice. And until she made that choice, she was functionally immortal. And the deadline for making this irrevocable decision was when her father Elrond sails to the west. The same choice also, and the same deadline applied to her brothers as well. The choice of Lúthien refers to the fact that normally a person's doom cannot be changed. The Perithal, the half-elves, they straddled the line between mortal and immortal, but those who were fully immortal could not give up immortality, and those who were fully mortal could not attain immortality, though their lifespans could be altered, such as the Dunedain. The only exceptions to the irrevocable doom happened by divine intervention for Lúthien, who became mortal, and Tur, who became immortal. In both cases, these were made to not be sundered from their true loves. Beren was mortal, Idril was immortal, thus these couples could be together forever. So if Arwen had remained immortal and just sort of hung around until Aragorn died and then goes to the Undying Lands, she would be forever sundered from Aragorn. Elves do not remarry generally. I mean, Feanor's father did, but that's about it. And it was a very, very interesting situation. By becoming mortal, now she can pass from the circles of the world and go to the same place that Aragorn goes when he died, wherever that may be. So she could be with him forever. Of course, it's a tough choice. She has to give up ever seeing her family again, although she has family that were mortal too. So there you go. Either way, it's sort of meant to be a bittersweet thing. But it would have been very cruel if she said, I choose to be immortal. I'll stay with my husband until he dies, and then I'll just go hang out with dad and mom, wherever they are. Erisea, Eldamar, Valinor, wherever they wound up, then she would never have love until the world ended and the second music happens, and who knows how long that would be. I mean, Tolkien talked about 10,000 centuries, being a possible timeline there. So, all right, next question. Our next question comes in from Martin de Kroon, who asks, is it possible that Eru Ilúvatar intended Faramir to be in the council, if not the company, since the dream came first to him and multiple times at that? No. If that were the case, then Faramir would have been at the council. While it is true that Faramir beheld this dream first and multiple times, this does not mean that he was meant to be at the council, nor was the dream likely directly from Ilúvatar. When we examine the text that describes the dream, it seems much more likely the work of the Valar rather than Ilúvatar, most likely Irmo. Let's take a look at that passage. In that dream, I thought the eastern sky grew dark, and there was a growing thunder. But in the west a pale light lingered, and out of it I heard a voice, remote but clear, crying, Seek for the sword that was broken. In Imladris it dwells. There shall be counsels taken, stranger than Morgul spells. There shall be shown a token that doom is near at hand. For Isildur's bane shall waken, and the halfling forth shall stand. So Boromir here describes his dream as well as, what the voice said, and including the important elements of Imladris and Isildur's bane and halfling. After conferring with his brother, they realized that while Faramir had been having a recurrent dream, the fact that they both had the same dream was significant. So then they spoke to their father, Denethor. And he didn't know anything about halflings, and he didn't know anything about Isildur's bane, but he knew that Imladris was an elvish land to the north. Boromir, of course, insisted on being the one to go, and as Faramir pointed out later, once Boromir set his mind to something, there's no changing his mind. Now, note the theme here in the dream, not merely the voice's words, but darkness from the east, not capitalized, but a pale light from the west, which is capitalized. And this is where the voice issues from. The voice isn't coming from heaven or the timeless halls, it's coming from the Undying Lands. This squarely puts this dream as the work of the Valar, not Ilúvatar directly. Now, Irmo, also known as Lorien, he's the Valar most associated with dreams and visions. It seems likely to be his doing. That being said, if Faramir had gone and Boromir had stayed, consider the implication. Perhaps Faramir would not have tried to take the ring from Frodo as Boromir did, as he was stronger in spirit. This means Aragorn absolutely does not become the king. Without Faramir, there is no return of the king. Denethor II had planned to reject Aragorn's claim, and Boromir likely would have followed suit. While it is possible that Boromir may have eventually been swayed by Aragorn, we have to understand the reasoning that Faramir did this. Faramir did not know Aragorn the way that Boromir did. He didn't spend a lot of time with him. He didn't really travel with him. He didn't really get to know him that much. He recognized Aragorn as king because of all the prophecies that Aragorn had fulfilled. Boromir may have been following a prophetic dream, but he wasn't a scholar like his father, like his brother. He seemed to view wizards and elves with some contempt. On top of this, removing Faramir from Ithilien, it means a much harder road for Frodo and Sam because Faramir had sheltered and resupplied them. The simple fact, though, is that Ilúvatar himself, if Ilúvatar himself had needed Faramir to go to Rivendell, then Faramir would have been in Rivendell. That's just the way it works. Okay. Let's move on to the next question. The next question comes in from Rain Normal. This is a question that I've covered many times. I don't know if I've done it in a YouTube video or not, but here I am doing it. In The Lord of the Rings, what is the difference between goblins, orcs, and uruks? There is no difference between these other than linguistic differences. The goblins that appeared in The Hobbit are the very same creatures as the orcs and the uruks appearing in The Lord of the Rings, and the orcs spelled with a K that Tolkien mentioned in his later letters. The only difference is referring to them in differing languages, or in the case of orc with a C or orc with a K, different spelling. Late in life, Tolkien liked it with a K. Goblin is unquestionably an English word. It's a word that, of course, predates Tolkien by quite a bit. In universe, though, we can follow what I mentioned earlier, the author's conceit that Tolkien... Oh, I didn't write these words. I translated them. So we can understand that the choice to say goblin in The Hobbit was translating the Westron word orca, or orc, into a familiar English word. The Hobbit does recognize that goblin and orc are the same, though. First, in the prelude, it mentions that goblins in the story are also called orcs, and that this is unrelated to the orca related to sea life. Later, in the main text, when Bilbo and company reach Rivendell and they meet Elrond, he identifies two of the swords that they are carrying, Glamdring, and more relevant to my point, Orcrist, which he translates as Goblin Cleaver. The Lord of the Rings in-universe, written mostly by Frodo and Sam rather than Bilbo, favors orcs, and the Silmarillion does as well. This doesn't mean that goblin is never used, just that it isn't favored. Uruk is what they call themselves, both in the various Orcish dialects and also the black speech of Mordor. In Quenya Elvish, they are Orkor. In Sindarin Elvish, they are Urch. In later-day Numenor's Adunaic, which is the root of Westron, they would have been called Urku. The other root of Adunaic would be Middle-earth's indigenous Druidine tongue, which called them Gurgun, which is a possible in-universe root of goblin. The only ones that were really a separate thing would be the Uruk-hai, which is goblin man. They're hybrids created by Saruman, who have both Orcish and Mannish ancestry. The ones with more Orcish traits were Uruk-hai, while the ones that look closer to mortal men were called half-orcs. So there you have it. It's really just, they're called a lot of different things, but they're all the same actual creatures. A lot of people tend to think that they're different in one way or another. And I got a really interesting comment here. I can't seem to find it. Where did that comment go? There was a comment where somebody mentioned that they had it in their head, previous to reading what I wrote, that goblins were like the underground variant. And it's interesting because there's a little bit to this. It's not that the ones that live underground are goblins and the ones that don't live underground are orcs, but there's this line in The Hobbit. I wish I could find the comment. I don't know if the person deleted their comment or what, but it was a good comment. I wanted to read it and let you guys know who wrote it, but I don't see it here. But in The Hobbit, there's this sort of line where, they mention that there are different sizes of goblins, and they say, like, the bigger ones are the orcs of the mountain or something like that. And so you're thinking the goblins, underground, orcs, mountain. But also keep in mind that in The Hobbit, they also call the larger goblins hobgoblins. So there's that as well. All right, let's move on to your next question. Our next question comes in from Ryan Samansky, and I hope I'm saying that right, who asks, why does Tolkien use gray for camouflages? Elves, rangers, and even the Three Hunters use gray clothes and cloaks for camo. Tolkien was a soldier in the British Army, which used brown camo. The Germans tended to wear gray uniforms. So I'm going to largely ignore the commentary on British and German uniforms. I'm going to sort of address it, but it really doesn't have anything to do with The Lord of the Rings, I'm going to be honest with you. Camouflage is meant to blend in with your surroundings. Different surroundings require different camouflage. The cloaks given to the party in The Lord of the Rings were magic, and they were not of any particular color. The first mention of them states that it is difficult to discern their color, as seen here. I'm going to read you a little bit of The Lord of the Rings. The elves next unwrapped and gave to each of the company the clothes they had brought. For each they had provided a hood and a cloak, made according to his size, of the light but warm silken stuff that the Galathrim wove. It was hard to say of what color they were. Gray with the hue of twilight under the trees they seemed to be, and yet if they were removed or set in another light, they were green, or shadowed leaves, or brown, as fallow fields by night, dusk silver, as water under stars. Each cloak was fastened about the neck with a brooch like a green leaf veined with silver. Are these magic cloaks? Asked Pippin, looking at them with wonder. I do not know what you mean by that, answered the leader of the elves. They are fair garments. And the web is good, for it was made in this land. They are elvish robes, certainly, if that is what you mean. Leaf and branch, water and stone, they have the hue and beauty of all these things under the twilight of Lorien that we love. For we put the thought of all that we love into all that we make. Yet they are garments, not armor, and they will not turn shaft or blade. But they should serve you well. They are light to wear and warm enough, or cool enough at need. And you will find them great aid in keeping out the sight of unfriendly eyes, whether you walk among the stones or the trees. You are indeed high of the favour of the lady, for she herself and her maidens wove this stuff. Never before have we clad strangers in the garb of our own people. So, of course, the elf that Pippin speaks to, he somewhat bristles at the term magic. Elves always react this way. They only use the term magic to refer to the device of the enemy. Black magic and such. However, Tolkien uses it to describe whatever it is that a race can do that another cannot. To the elves, the cloaks are just what they wear, and they work as intended. But to the hobbits, they're magic. The text states that they seem gray under the current conditions, but they change colors as they move, mentioning, green and brown and dusk silver. Whatever was worn in World War I has no bearing on the Lord of the Rings. And to mention the Rangers, they wore both green and gray, so there's that as well. It's not so okay. We got to get into this whole allegory discussion again. I know. The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory for a particular real-life war, nor is it an allegory for anything. As pointed out by the book itself, provided you're not reading the first edition, you can find the following in the foreword. I'm going to read you a little bit of the foreword here. The crucial chapter, The Shadow of the Past, is one of the oldest parts of the tale. It was written long before the foreshadow of 1939, and yet became a threat of inevitable disaster, and from that point the story would have developed along essentially the same lines, if that disaster had been averted. Its sources are things long before in mind, or in some cases already written, and little or nothing in it was modified by the war that began in 1939 or its sequels. The real war does not resemble the legendary war in its process or its conclusion. If it had inspired or directed the development of the legend, then certainly the ring would have been seized and used against Sauron. He would not have been annihilated, but enslaved, and Barad-dûr would not have been destroyed, but occupied. Saruman, failing to get possession of the ring, would, in the confusion and treacheries of the time, had been found in Mordor the missing links of his own researches into ring lore, and therefore long he would have made a great ring of his own, with which to challenge the self-styled ruler of Middle-earth. In that conflict both sides would have held hobbits in hatred and contempt. They would not long have survived, even as slaves. Other arrangements could be devised according to the tastes or views of those who like allegory or topical reference. But I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or legend, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed dominion of the author. So, while you could apply the didactic messages of Tolkien's work to any portion of your daily life that you wish, you cannot impose upon the author or impose upon the work of the author an allegory. It doesn't work that way. The author is the one that imposes the allegory on the reader, not the other way around. This is in a large part why Tolkien disliked allegory. He did not like interpretations to be imposed upon him, and he did not like to impose upon others in that way. The cloaks are camouflage in a sense, but they are magic camouflage, and their colors do not represent any sort of allegiance to any nation, real or imagined, not even Lothlorien. The colors of these cloaks are entirely reliant on their surroundings, and as pointed out by Legolas earlier in the story, Lothlorien looks very different based on what season of the year it is. If the Fellowship had arrived a few months later in spring rather than in winter, they may have found the cloaks to appear golden at first, for example. So there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Link of Wise, who asks, why was Melian the only Maiar to have children were others like Sauron, Olorin, and Uinen unable, unwilling, or not allowed to have them? I like this question because this isn't a subject that comes up a lot. The subject of the Ainur and their ability to have children is very interesting, and it's difficult to navigate properly. But the short answer is that any one of them were capable of having children. In the very early writings of Tolkien's Legendarium, the Ainur had children all the time. Some of the Valar were even children of other Valar. One such example was a character called Ilúvatar. He was a Vala that was the son of Tulkas and Nessa, but he was ultimately written out of the story altogether. Another example was Orma, was originally Aula's son with Yavanna, and I suppose this original version of Aula was sort of a bit of a two-timer because he also got with Vanna and had a daughter named Niliqui. Now, these second-generation Valar were called Valarindi, which transliterates as Children of the Powers. The only Valarindi that survived into the canon Legendarium were Orome and Nessa, who were brother and sister. Orome and Nessa were just reworked as being first generation, or I should say only generation Valar. Some of the children of the Valar got reworked as Maiar. For example, Fianwe and Arenti were originally Valarindi children of Manwe and Varda. They became Maiar, called Eanwa and Ilmare. Kalimbo was Melkor's son. His mother was an ogress. He got reworked into being Gothmog, who was also a Maya. The rest of them were just written out entirely. So why the change? In the early writings, Tolkien was writing the Valar to be sort of like a pantheon of gods, like the ones found, for example, in Greek mythology. However, as he revised his work, they became more akin to higher-tier angels from Christian mythology, and thus they did not have children because only God can make more angels. Of course, there is the exception of Melian and Thingol, but the daughter of an angel and elf was an elf, Luthien, keeping it consistent with the thought that angels cannot propagate themselves. We don't have any examples of Valar or Maiar having children with each other, and it stands to reason, considering Tolkien's beliefs, that they probably can't do this. The history of Middle-earth gives us a lot of background information about how the coupling of Ilúthingol and Melian worked and how it was viewed by the Valar. It wasn't discouraged. It wasn't seen as evil in any way, but there were guidelines that she had to follow. While Melian was never said to explicitly incarnate herself, it was said that she did have to remain in the form that she was in for the duration of her relationship with Ilúthingol, and it is my opinion that she did incarnate. It just wasn't mentioned that she did, because I feel that she would have had to have incarnated herself. She would have had to give herself real form, a real body to bear a child. She didn't become an elf, like some people say, but she became an incarnate akin to the wizards. She had a real body. This is kind of poetic in a sense because she was once the leader of a group of Maiar called the Guardians, and all of them except for her would become the wizards. So it stands to reason that any of the Maiar, and indeed any of the Valar, as the difference between them is a categorization of power, not a difference of nature, could have children as long as they couple themselves with the children of Ilúvatar. As the offspring of one of the Ainur with an elf was an elf, it stands to reason that if they coupled with a mortal, then the offspring would be mortal. We don't really have examples of this happening, but of course that doesn't mean that it never happened. Just that Melian and Thingol were the only ones that the elves wrote about, and therefore they wound up in the Silmarillion. Okay, let's move on to the last question. Our last question is also from Link of Wise, who asks, if the Silmarils burned, why didn't Morgoth, Mathros, and Maglor just put them in their pockets or bags? Well, you're kind of underestimating how much they burned. Firstly, you need to understand the nature of the burning. The Silmarils are not hot. They could be touched and handled. They didn't give off heat. Luthien wore one on her chest for decades, and her son, Dior, and her grandson, Eärendil, both held them with no issues. The nature of the burning is not heat, it's holiness. Varda hallowed the Silmarils after they were made by Feanor, so that no evil could touch them. So they only burn the wicked. The next thing to talk about, however, is the burning doesn't stop once you stop holding it. Morgoth's hand hurt him for the rest of his time in the world. Now consider that Mathros only had one hand left when he held the Silmaril, and imagine the suffering of having only one hand and it was burning like that. The second big thing to consider is that Morgoth was burned by the Silmarils and he was not directly holding them. This may or may not be due to the fact that Morgoth was far more evil than the likes of Mathros or Maglor, or the fact that it was all three Silmarils, but he did not need to make contact with them to be burned. And I'm going to read you a brief passage from the Silmarillion. In his right hand Morgoth held close the Silmarils, and though they were locked in a crystal casket, they had begun to burn him. And his hand was clenched in pain, but he would not open it. Nay, he said, thou hast had thy due. For with my power that I put into thee, thy work was accomplished. I need thee no more. These things thou shalt not have nor see. I named them unto myself forever. So the Silmarillion is quick to point out that the Silmarils in this instance were in a crystal casket, but the burning started after a time. He had been carrying them for a while. He had traveled all the way to the north of Aemon, and then traveled all the way across the Helcaraxa before having his conversation in Middle-earth with Ungoliant in a place that would later be called Lamath. So it seems that either the casket dulled the burning for a time, but it was being overcome, or perhaps Morgoth simply had not noticed the burning at first. He maybe has a high pain threshold, or even perhaps that the more evil he becomes, the worse the burning is, and in his betrayal of his ally, Ungoliant, they started to burn even through the casket. Whichever of these we believe, keeping it in your pocket is no protection from this sort of holy burning. Now, I want you to think of the One Ring as being an evil example here. Gollum initially wore it all the time, but eventually he couldn't stand it. This was the One Ring starting to distance itself from Gollum so that it could abandon him. He started carrying it in his pocket, but eventually it galled him. That was the word that Tolkien used. And he kept it in a secret spot, only taking it out to use to hunt for food. This showed that the One Ring did not need to be on his finger or even directly touching him to have this effect. It did a similar thing to Isildur. He found the ring painful to touch after attempting to bend it to his will. The One Ring did not need to be touched to have an effect on somebody. Smeagol murdered his only friend to get it. He was not a good person, but he wasn't anything more than a troublemaker and a bully before this. He wasn't a murderer. Similarly, Boromir was affected by the One Ring without ever touching it, and Saruman never even saw the One Ring, and he was enamored of it. This is why, the sort of like, let's tie the One Ring to a chicken. It's a funny meme that goes around, but it's not something that works within Tolkien's established rules of how these things work. The same could be said for the Silmarils. They were similar to the One Ring in a way. They were incredibly seductive, but, except that they were not evil. They were holy. So you don't need to be touching it directly. If you put it in your pocket, you're just going to burn your leg, or if your back pocket, you're going to burn your bottom. If you put it in a bag and you're keeping it anywhere near you, it's going to hurt. Morgoth wound up putting them on an iron crown and wearing them on his head, and that still hurt him. It was just enough distance that he could wear it. And he didn't need to wear it. He just wanted to, because he was a maniac like that, but he still felt it. It still pained him. Anyway, that was the last question. If you guys reached the end of the video and you haven't subscribed, please do so. Please do so. We're trying to, I guess the next goal, 3,000 subscribers, right? I'm not sure what we'll do at 3,000. We'll come up with something special. There should be a stream on the channel next week. I'm going to be setting up multi-streaming so that we could do it on Twitch and YouTube at the same time. So be ready to not have to go to Twitch if you don't want to, although you can come to Twitch if you'd like. We're going to be doing, like I said, a simulcast on both Twitch and YouTube next Thursday, which, if you're watching this and you're not a member, is tomorrow, the day it comes out, because I put these out on Wednesdays. So there's that. That'll be with the Council of Tolkien with me and Matt and Sid. So that should be a lot of fun. I'm gonna have to call them and work at the details of what we're gonna be talking about and everything. But that should be pretty interesting. I will see you guys next time. And if you're already subscribed, you want to consider Membership, it costs very little. It's like $5 a month. You get some emotes, and those are going to be used in chat. We have a One Ring, we have a Silmaril, we have Sauron's Eye, and I think like 1 or 2 others. And we'll be adding more as time goes on. You also get to see all the videos early, and I thank you to everybody that has joined the channel as a member, because it does help me out greatly. I will see you guys next time.